Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Intermodal 101, Getting Started in Intermodal. I'm Hal Pollard, the Director of Education at IANA. Today's session is part of a new collection of tools that IANA has put together to help educate users about how intermodal works and why it's a smart freight choice. I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator, Mr. Jeff Brashears, the Senior Vice President in Sales and National Accounts at Suntech TTS, who will introduce our esteemed panel. To you, Jeff.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Our two esteemed panelists today are Derek Broom, who is Vice President of Intermodal at CAT Global Incorporated. Derek and I used to work together at Railvan and Pacer. And Rick Legore, who is the CEO of Intech Freight and Logistics in Indianapolis, Indiana. We have a number of slides to show you today, and what we're going to do is we're going to start the presentation with Derek. Rick will then continue to the end where we will have questions from the audience and for the audience. So Derek, if you could maybe give them a little of your background and then get started, I would appreciate it.
Yes, my name is Derek Broom, and I started in the intermodal, as Jeff said, with Railvan, and worked thereafter with Pacer and XPO, and have been doing this about 20-some years. So I've worked a little bit on various sides of the organization. I worked in the trucking, a little bit with the railroads, as well as with the 3PL and the intermodal section. Gotten a little experience working my way up the chain and enjoyed every minute of it. So to get started here, okay, our structure is going to start with what is intermodal. And then we're going to give you the top 5 benefits of intermodal. We're going to talk about some of the common misconceptions about intermodal. We'll talk about what makes for a good intermodal lane. And then we'll figure it out with why now is the time to start integrating intermodal into your supply chain. Then what you need to know in order to get involved in intermodal, and how do I get started. So the first question, what is intermodal? The definition of intermodal is involving 2 or more different modes of transportation and conveying goods pertaining to or suitable for transportation involving more than one form of carrier, truck, rail, or truck, ship, and rail. So for the purposes of this discussion today, we're going to talk about the long-haul movement of shipping containers and trailers, be it rail and truck, where rail is utilized for the long-haul segment, and the truck is used for the pickup and delivery dray to and from the customer in the intermodal ramps. So let's begin with domestic intermodal as a service model. To begin with domestic intermodal, what happens is the shipper or the distribution center loads a drayage truck on the front end, and then that truck would drive to the railroad, deposit that container with the railroad would load it, and take it from the origin ramp to the destination ramp, where it's picked up by another truck at end, which is the drayage component for the delivery, and that can be then taken either to a distribution center, the manufacturer, or directly to a retail store. The same is done with international intermodal service models. The shipper's loaded or the distribution center loads it, and then it would go via steamship line to the origin port. It travels on that line until it reaches the destination port. It can then go directly into a rail segment, which the railroad unloads it directly from the cargo line. Then they ship it inbound where a destination dray is waiting to take it to a distribution center, manufacturer, or directly to a retail store. Really depends on how they want it set up. What you'll find is we've got listed here is the major intermodal routes, and you'll find that there's a number of railroads that come together to make this happen. So in the north, where you're looking at Canada, there's the CN railroads and the CP railroads. When you come into the United States, you'll see going out of, say, Chicago to the West Coast, you have the BN Santa Fe and the Union Pacific railroads. And going east, you have the Norfolk Southern and the CSX. Southeast, you'll have the FEC, who takes it from Jacksonville into the Miami area. Then along the south, you'll also see that you have the KCS, the KCSM, which is the Mexico component, and then the FXE, who also travels within Mexico. And then not to leave out one of the short lines that I didn't mention on the West Coast, which is the Iowa Interstate. So there are a number of railroads there that all traverse the United States and Canada, Mexico, and some of them have interline agreements which allow the containers to go from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, or from the north into the south. To get a little bit into more detail as that comes along, it's a way to get your shipments basically all over Canada, directly into Mexico, or to the West Coast, or to the East Coast, and so forth. The different equipment types. Now, the first being the 53 domestic container, and you'll see in quotations there, container on a flat car. So these move throughout North America, and again, we assume here kind of a max weight of 42.5, and the reason being is that most of your tractors, when you put it together with the chassis and the container, then that would get to about your 80,000 pound limit in the United States. These containers are able to be double stacked, and the railroads have lately been working on a way to make sure that every route that they take allow for double stack containers to traverse that area. In the past, there were some routes where double stacking was not allowed, or they weren't able to make the clearance, and the railroads have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years working on that. The next containers that we're going to talk about are the ISO boxes. So these are the steamship line boxes used for import, exports, and when you have the opportunities for domestic. Now, when we talk about repositioning, one of the things that is the steamship lines usually, as we talked about, ship intact inbound into Chicago or into an eastern port or eastern area. And what they're trying to do is get them back to their port so that they can get them loaded back on the ships. So the way to defray that cost is by loading that container back. So a lot of times you'll have opportunity to get a better rate by loading a repo box back. Now you'll see the sizes that there's 20 foot, 40 foot, and 45 foot.
Derek, from a service standpoint, is there any difference between shipping an ISO box and a 53-foot container?
No, the real differences, Jeff, are some of the weight constraints and the time spent either in the port or getting it to the rail yard. And a little bit is where the chassis comes from. So on the big box supply, Jeff, the chassis are supplied right by the railroads. And in the case of the smaller box, the ISO boxes, you have to figure out where the chassis supply is coming from, and there are multiple chassis providers, and the steamship lines will let you know who those are. And then some of the drayage companies now have their own chassis, so in talking to them, you can find out if you're able to use one of theirs or you have to use one of the other providers.
Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome. The next type of container is the 53 COFC and TOFC reefers. So a reefer is a refrigerated container, and that allows you to set your temperature to whatever's needed for that customer, and then they keep them gassed up and running along the lines so that your freight stays at the correct temperature throughout its process. And when we talk a little bit about the TOFC, the difference in that and COFC is that COFC, as we talked about before, is a container on flat car. Well, TOFC is a trailer on a flat car, which means you put one box, which has wheels, and it has to be then clipped into that well car, and you can only ship one in that car. So instead of having double stack, you have a single. And I believe those routes are a little bit more controlled, but again, going to your provider or talking to your 3PL company, they'll let you know where that makes sense. And here it says TLC is a little bit better on weight. In general, what you'll find is that TLC container probably will give you about 1,000 extra pounds in comparison to a container and a chassis. And then kind of the market snapshot by box count. What this is meant to display is that there are a number of containers in the market and kind of who has provided them. So you have the EMP supply, and then the UMAX supply, which are the railroads, And then you have the Hub Group, XPO Logistics, some other small private fleets, CSX, Swift, Schneider, and Hunt.
Derek, can you tell us the difference between the EMP fleet and the UMAX fleet?
The EMP fleet is a little bit older, Jeff, and it travels in a little bit of a different way. So right now, I know that cross-border in some locations you have to use EMPs, and then it depends on whose agreement with the railroads they are. So the UMAX, what you'll find is that CSX and the UP and then NS and UP have different agreements about, kind of who owns the UMAX as well as the boxes.
So EMP is Norfolk Southern, UP, and
UP,
UMAX
correct.
is
CSX.
And it's basically a public box supply, correct?
That is correct. So if you're not an asset owner, as some of these others are, then what you can do is use the EMP boxes or the UMAX boxes to load your equipment back and forth. And then what you'll find is on the BNSF, you have to have your own equipment. So most of the asset providers are playing in that venue unless you find a third party who has some boxes supply that allows you to use the BNSF as well. And then the top 5 benefits of intermodal, and that would be scalable capacity. So again, when you're talking about the public boxes, the EMPs with the Norfolk Southern and the P and the UMAX, which are the CSX and the UP, you have quite a number of containers that you can use in order to augment, the capacity that you have at a place in time. So if you're currently doing truck and you're running out of assets or asset providers to give you that equipment, this is definitely a way of increasing your capacity immediately. And then in a tightening market, it provides shippers with an alternative for 53-foot capacity. So, as everybody predicts that the market is going to start tightening up, or when you see that produce season starts and the trucks dry up in a certain area, this is definitely a way to increase your capacity. Cost efficient. What you find that there's an average of 15% to 18% improvement over truck. Now, I will say that you have to do is, you'll find that the closer you are to the rail ramps, that percentage increases, and then the other piece of that is the longer that the mileage is on those loads. So you'll find after you get over 500 and you start getting toward 1,000, 2,000 miles, that intermodal becomes a definite option for transit as well as the cost. And then reliable and predictable. The railroad has standardized routes and they're running every day. And unlike a truck who may need a team or whose single driver has hours of service, the railroads run 24/7. So it's always there. The capacity is there every day. And then security. What you'll find is the railroads are very much more secure because you're unable to really get at the freight while it's on the rail. So you have the drayage at the front end or the drayage at the back end that makes it like OTR. And then environmentally responsible. 5.4 pounds of carbon dioxide versus 19.8 via truck. So as your customers discuss what the carbon footprint is, and you're looking at, a way of being more efficient, the rail is certainly a great option for that. You get multiple containers on one train as opposed to one container, one trailer with every truck.
Thanks, Derek. I'd like to turn the next section over to Rick Legore, who is CEO of Intech Freight and Logistics in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Thanks, Jeff. As Jeff said, I'm Rick Legore, CEO of Intech Freight and Logistics. I've been in the freight industry for probably a little over 20 years. Part of the time I've been a buyer of freight, and really the last 15 years I've focused on logistics and transportation, with really the last 15 really all about domestic intermodal, trying to help shippers transition their truckload or find capacity for their truckload lanes of 750 miles or more. So I'm going to jump in and start talking a little bit. We'll just jump into common misconceptions about intermodal. And what I'd like to start off with is I think a lot of the misconceptions they all start from the thought process that a number of people think that intermodal is just like truck. And what we like to tell our shippers, it is very much truck-like. And I think a lot of the reasons a lot of people think it's very much like, it's exactly like truck is, okay, they've got a 53-foot container sitting at their dock doors. In a lot of cases, a number of shippers that we've worked with in the past haven't even known that intermodal is sitting at their dock. So I think that kind of drives a little bit of it. But let me just jump into it and start to go through each one of these. At first, I'm just going to list off some of the misconceptions, and I'll go into more detail as I go through this. So one of them is slow transits. Another is there's high damage and loss. Unreliable service. It's complicated. And I get that, but we'll get into the details on that. Lack of visibility. Another one out there is a misconception is limited service provider options. And another is that not so great for big box retailers. But as I said, these are misconceptions, and I'm going to jump into each one of them and try to get through these. So one of them has to do with long transit. So a lot of folks think that, if you're going to go intermodal, you're going to go ahead and have transits of a week or more. And I think a lot of that comes from some of the folks that we work with on intermodal or try to transition to intermodal. They're used to working with rail cars, and rail cars, yes, do take quite a bit longer than intermodal, but the railroads know that their competition for their intermodal product is truck. So as you can see on the chart off to the right, those items or those lanes that are highlighted in green are essentially very truck-like. So, you can take a look at Chicago, the first one on the chart, Chicago to Dallas. You can see that available at second day 8 a.m. versus truck actually second day p.m. So that's actually an improvement in there. But as you go through those, there are a number of them that are truck-like. But overall, as you're looking at and you're selling intermodal to shippers, essentially you should really think about it, it's truck plus a day. That's pretty safe. Now, when you have to interline between different class ones, so if you're going from LA over to Jersey, you're going to have to interline, and that interline is going to happen in Chicago, and that's going to usually add another additional day. So we like to say if you're going to go interline, assume basically truck plus 2 days. But overall, most of it's truck plus a day. We will say, and I will add, that there are expedite options on some lanes. And then also, you should consider when you're looking at the transits that trains are moving over the weekend as well. So that can help out certain circumstances. Okay, so now we're going to jump on to some misconceptions, high damage and loss. What we'll say is our experience has been that the damage and loss has actually been lower for us on our intermodal services than they have been on our truckload services. And it really gets down to, has the product been properly blocked and braced? And that has a lot to do with whether or not you're going to have damage. It also has some stuff to do with the weight, and I'll get to that a little bit later. And because there is shifting that can occur, it's a little bit different in the intermodal containers than what you will have in truckload. As I said, I'll get to that a little bit later. But just know that the railroads are very, very interested in helping you and the shipper have a great service for your customers. And because of that, they will actively get involved in dealing with a particular commodity or a particular customer. They'll do site visits. And as you can see, this particular one right here, one of our customers, as you can see, this is paper rolls. We gave them the commodity, we gave them the weight on each one of the rolls, and they went ahead and gave us the load diagram. And they do this for a number of customers that we have, and it's just part of the program that they offer as you're working with them. And in terms of the blocking and bracing, I know a lot of people get a little bit scared about that as well. In some cases, the blocking and bracing could be as easy as a couple 2x4s and some 16-penny nails that go ahead and get taken care of as the load's being packed out. So in terms of addressing the issue of the complicated, again, blocking and bracing can be time-consuming and costly. And as I just said, it could be just a couple 2x4s and some 16-penny nails that are taken care of on the dock. So it really isn't as complicated. Multiple providers per lane. There are a lot of different things about intermodal, and just getting started, it can sound complicated because you've got the dray in the front end, you got the dray in the back end, plus you've got the long haul that's going over Class 1 railroads. An easy way to get started, though, to get yourself in a position to start being familiar with the intermodal product and being comfortable with intermodal services and offering those to shippers, is the railroads have door-to-door services. And in that case, you're only dealing with one provider. So, and it very much looks like truck for your operators, and it very much looks like truck for your shippers that you're working with. In that the dispatchers are making one phone call into the Class 1's door-to-door services, and they will go ahead and they handle the dray. They pay the dray drivers directly themselves, and then they handle the line haul. So you're basically setting up, much like you set up truckload brokerage, one call handles it all when you do a door-to-door service. So that's one not to make it as complicated as you're first starting out, because there are a number of options, and we'll go through that a little bit. One of the important questions that asked when you're going through is that commodity. There can be some commodities that are considered prohibited and some that are restricted. Prohibited means no questions asked, can't have any product of that type on the particular container. And then restricted, these would be products that can be loaded, but they have some caveats and limitations. And in some cases, those differ based off of if it's a public railroad box or a private owned box. But that would be something that just to work through. And then one of the other things in terms of complications, some shippers say it doesn't work with their TMS. Well, when they're working with an IMC like yourself or a 3PL or a broker, what they end up doing when the shipper, all they have to deal with is that one transaction that they're dealing with you. They don't have to deal with the dray on either end. They're just getting one transaction and it's moving through their system. In terms of lack of visibility, this is one that is surprising to a number of people. So, I mean, this is an example of door-to-door tracking that we had in a particular container. And this looks very much like, a FedEx or a UPS shipment as it's getting scanned, as it's going through its various transits. And right here, you can see that these boxes are getting scanned as they're progressing across the railroad going from Chicago, finally into Compton. So in terms of the fear of having lack of visibility, that's a fear that you don't really have to have. Another one that we get into is limited service providers. Well, that is true in that you only have certain railroads that you run across. As you saw earlier, you saw the network map, and yes, there aren't hundreds and hundreds of rails that you can run across, but there are a number of them, and each one of them has their own specific points that they run off of. Also under that, there are various IMC options. So you have your bimodals, which that's essentially J.B. Hunt, where they have assets both in a significant volume in terms of containers and then also in terms of dray capacity. Then you have asset-light IMCs who own some boxes and own some of the dray, but basically they go ahead and manage their peak capacity or needs on lanes that they don't have their assets on through the public boxes that they can get through the railroads, or they may work with another IMC or bimodal to try to get that. And then there's non-asset IMCs that are out there that they don't own anything, and they're working with the bimodals, the Class 1 railroads on the door services, or they have their own ramp-to-ramp rate and have developed their own dray network. Now, there also are, as I mentioned earlier, there are multiple routes. So, for example, yes, BN and UP run through LA, but they're not running through LA on the same line. So as you're working with shippers and trying to come up with solutions, one of the examples that I can throw out here is last year when there were fires in Los Angeles, BNSF could not get themselves in and out of LA because of where the fires were at. Whereas we were going to all our customers or potential customers that we know here in town and on our customer list that use the BN, that gave us a great opportunity to go run to them and say, hey, we've got options for the UP. We can get you in and out of the city and into your destinations without any problem because UP runs on a different set of rails out of there. Also, on that front, so you've got, for example, LA, yes, BN and UP are there, but I'll give you another example where there are multiple routes and multiple ramps. So a nice ramp that Union Pacific has is they have a ramp out in Salt Lake City. BN doesn't have that. It's not like a McDonald's where every corner you see McDonald's, you're going to see a Wendy's on the other corner. Ramps aren't like that. In some cases, a city will have ramps that are supported by multiple railroads. In some cases, a city is only sponsored by one railroad. And as I said, gave the example of the Salt Lake City. In terms of different services, as Derek mentioned, there's TOFC and COFC products, and that can be run on various lines and on various ramps. There's also various private box owners that you also saw that were out there. So again, it's not limited to just a handful of providers. And then you also have the opportunity to do ramp-to-ramp and door-to-door services. So once you take all of these things into play and you start running the numbers, you've got multiple options out of multiple cities to be able to provide a service for your shippers that you're working with. So another misconception is that big box, where a lot of the product is going anymore, is not a good option for the retailers. And I will just happen to add that it's actually much easier to manage the buffer window on positioning the deliveries if you're 50 miles outside of destination versus where you're trying to manage going 3,000 miles and trying to make the red delivery date and you're trying to go 3,000 miles. There's a lot of things that can happen in those 3,000 miles. Whereas if you pre-position your deliveries within 50 miles and you have 1 to 2 days before the red requirement comes up, I mean, you have a lot of opportunity to go ahead and make things right. And also, you're only dealing with 50 miles, and you've got multiple options on dray providers to be able to get that 50 miles taken care of, which adds to you can throw a great deal of volume. Say you're running a fence order for one of your customers. By having intermodal as an option, you can throw a lot of dray activity, a lot of boxes on these fence orders to go ahead and get them to the ramp, and then go ahead and do the final delivery, because a single driver can do a number of moves if it's within 50 miles. So it definitely helps off the services and provides the capacity that's needed on programs like that. So with that in mind, what makes for a good intermodal lane? Well, length of haul. Generally, it makes sense, and once you start to get to 700 miles or more. Now, that does change a little bit when you start to look at dray distance from ramps. As Derek said, as a line haul gets longer, the opportunity to lengthen that dray on either end becomes more of an option. So on your shorter intermodal lanes, it's very beneficial. The closer to the ramp you are, the better off you're going to be. And then the longer lanes, you've got a little bit more flexibility where you can go out 100 or so miles and still make for a good intermodal lane. Weight. Weight is a big deal, and a lot of shippers have issues with this, and this is what happens with a lot of folks that end up starting off in intermodal. They miss out on the fact that you're going to have to load a little bit lighter. You're going to have to load roughly about 42.5. Now, there are some options on some other containers out there, trying to tap into a different dray market to try to lighten those loads so that you can get a little bit more. But as a general rule, we like to think of it as 42,500 as the guideline. The combination of the container and the chassis is heavier than just the trailer alone, which is why you're losing that pounds. The other thing that makes for a good intermodal lane is high value. Great option for Mexico, and as Derek had mentioned earlier, I mean, it's very hard to get a hold of that product when it's sitting on the rails. So, no better time than the present to go ahead and start moving with intermodal. And I'll list off a few reasons why. One, we've got a tighter driver market that's out there. Average age is 45, and we're having a hard time trying to find, as you guys know, new people to actually jump in and say, I want to be a truck driver as a career. Government regulations, these continue to add on. Electronic logs, we know, are going to be in place by the end of this year across everybody. There is aging equipment, and a lot of folks have held off on replacing some of their equipment, and the replacement costs are higher at this point. We have highway infrastructure issues, congestion, deterioration. So get this product off the road and onto the rails. It helps those situations. Access to capital is still very difficult, particularly for the smaller players, and we all know that the average fleet is right around 20 trucks. So there's a lot of small players out there in the truckload marketplace that will have difficulty trying to go ahead and access capital, and then also implement the electronic logs and other regulations that are being thrown on them. Very costly. Rising fuel, we've seen fuel go up pretty significantly here in the last 12 months. It's kind of settled back a little bit right now, but every indication is showing that we're going to continue to see that start to take back off again here very shortly. In addition to that, managing budgets, everybody's trying to figure out a way to cut costs. We've seen spot rates, whether you're watching it through the DAT numbers that come out weekly, or you watch the Journal of Commerce and look at their numbers that they put out there in terms of spot rates on both truckload and the intermodal market. They are going up, and this is a good way to try to go ahead and find those lanes that you can go ahead and transition from truck over to intermodal, save yourself 15 to 18%. So what are some of the things that you need to know about intermodal? Kind of the lookouts. Again, 42,500 versus 45,000 pounds. Blocking and bracing is absolutely a necessity on rail. Pricing options. So you've got guaranteed capacity pricing. So you can go to the railroads and say, I've got X number of moves in this particular lane for the entire year, and they will give you pricing on that guaranteed capacity. So when things tighten, so if you're in LA You've got product coming out of LA. We all know that the freight gets a little bit tight in LA when retail season starts to kick in and people are stocking their shelves. You can get guaranteed capacity, so when other people are having a difficulty finding boxes, you'll have that. You also get pricing on spot rates, and you can also get project rate pricing. Here's one that you need to look out for, and this is a terminal storage and per diem. It's not intended to be a revenue source, although it sure does feel like it sometimes, but it's really a means to go ahead and encourage people to go ahead and make sure that they manage the equipment, that the railroads and the other providers that you're going after make sure that you're managing that equipment and turning it appropriately. Everybody needs to make some money in the transaction, and if the containers are just sitting, that becomes a problem for people that own those assets. Now, I will say before I jump on to the next piece is that the terminal storage and the per diem, if you're doing the ramp and with the dray on both sides, they're pretty specific to terminal storage and per diem. It tends to be a little bit looser when you're doing the door-to-door product. The railroads tend to be a little bit more lenient on that. Not in all cases, but in many cases. So what you need to know, commodity, again, there's prohibited and restricted commodities. I talked about that a little bit earlier. Then the other thing to think about is our cut time. So while the railroads are running every day, as Derek had mentioned, it's important to pay attention to when those cut times are, when those trains have to be built and they're leaving the ramps. So when you go ahead and you're trying to figure out when you can go ahead and get this product picked up, you not only need to know when you can get it picked up, but how long is it going to take you to get to that ramp, get it ingated, and then be able to put on the train to build that train out. Sometimes when you get started, you miss that part. Also, I'll just kind of add on that is to review transits. Not every lane moves every day. So some lanes may only move Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, or Monday, Tuesday, Friday. Your high volume lanes, like in LA to Chicago, LA to Dallas, Atlanta, those high volume lanes, yes, they're moving every day, but there's going to be some other lanes that you're going to run across with your shippers that you're going to find out that, hey, that's not one that runs every day, but something to pay attention to. Blocking, bracing, and weight. I do a lot of writing of blogs, and the number one blog that I've written, I've got 75,000 people have looked at it, and it is, what is the number one issue? And it's weight. And basically what ends up happening, okay, so you can have a 42,500 pound load, but if you're not paying attention to the blocking and bracing and taking care of it, intermodal has what's known as harmonic vibration. It's not the same vibration that you have in a truck. So what I like to do, and this is kind of dating myself because I don't play, I never had the TV type games. I ended up having this, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but the electronic football game that you would plug it in and all the players would go ahead and vibrate and move down the field. Well, that's the best way I can explain harmonic vibration. There could be forward movement and side-to-side movement as the product sits in there. So what can end up happening is, as you can see in this diagram of the truck below, is that if it's not blocked and braced, what can happen is that you could be legal on the front end, but then after the load is ridden on the train, when it's unloaded and you're going to go across a scale again as you're making final delivery, you'll find that the load shifted. And if it shifts, then you're going to have some problems to going ahead, and it can be under on gross, but you may be over on axles. So weight is not only an issue, or blocking and bracing is not only an issue for damages, but it's also an issue to make sure that the weight stays where it was loaded initially. So how do we get started? First, you need to go ahead and take a look at the routes that you move for your providers or for your shippers, and look at it in terms of miles, weight, etc., and just figure out what are the opportunities that exist within the freight that you have today. Yes, there's a whole bunch of other freight that's possibly out there, but you'll be surprised at the shipments that you're moving today that sits right in the very sweet part of intermodal. You'll end up having to establish yourself with a credit, and that is, you're going to need to get credit with the railroads directly. And one of the things I did not mention is that the BN Railroad, while all the other railroads own their boxes, other folks, BNSF, they do not own their boxes. So when you're out there establishing credit, you're going to want to establish credit with the railroads for the product that moves on their lines. But if you want to get to the BNSF, you're going to have to work with one of the bimodals, primarily J.B. Hunt. There's some other guys out there, but J.B. Hunt owns the market in this place, and you'll need to figure out how to go ahead and tap into their market. Now, what I will say is you're also going to need to clear the BCO. So there may be another IMC out there or intermodal service provider out there that is already moving this freight intermodal. The railroads don't like to compete against themselves on the same lane, so they're going to ask what the beneficial cargo owner is to make sure that they're not already moving that freight on that particular lane. One of the other things I want to point out when you're going through that, all the Class 1s, you're not competing against them except if it's a CN or CP. Both the Canadian railroads do sell retail, so some of those shipments that you may be looking at, they may actually be your competition on that lane. So if you're looking to move it, very highly likely that you're not going to be able to get that particular move in any sort of way. Then after that, you go through that process, then you start talking with your customers and just establish solutions and see whether or not they're interested in you going out there and finding out what the pricing is to provide those options for them. And then at that point, you start moving the freight.
Thanks, Rick. You brought up Mexico, and I think it's probably pertinent to the discussion. You started this business about 5 years ago and really grew the business using the railroad's door services. Talk a minute about, I've got an opportunity, a customer calls me, I want to do Mexico. Tell me what the easiest way to do that cross-border is, and then I'd like Derek to speak to it for Canada.
Well, it's really not that bad there, Jeff. So the railroads will work directly with you on being able to do that. There's actually two different ways to get into Mexico. There's a steel wheel option and the rubber tire option. You'd think that the steel wheel would be actually cheaper, but it's not, and there's not a whole lot of options. There's really only two origin ramps that you can use the steel wheel. So essentially you're going to use the rubber tire option. The railroads you can work with directly on the door-to-door services, and they will go ahead and handle a lot of that work and heavy lifting for you. They have people that are bilingual and will do the communication with the folks down in Mexico if that's necessary. One thing I will point out before Derek jumps in here is that if you are shipping into Mexico, shippers need to be aware that once you cross that border, there is no insurance placed on that product. So you need to be self-insured, or something else needs to happen, or you just need to know that if something happens to that freight, once it crosses the border, you're on your own.
And have you ever experienced a loss in Mexico in the business that you've done?
No, we have not. Yeah, as Derek had said earlier, it's a lot harder to go ahead and get that product on those trains moving versus if it's over the road and some guy pulls off at a restaurant to grab a bite to eat or goes ahead and gets refueled. If he's in a truck, it's very easy to pick up and move that freight away from him while he steps away. Whereas if it's on the rail and on those well cars, it's very difficult to get a hold of that. And then once it's in the ramps are protected.
Amen. Derek, talk a little bit about doing business cross-border into Canada. And as Rick mentioned, the CN and the CP offer some retail direct services. Talk about Canada for us.
So they do, and unlike Mexico, you do have your insurance coverage when you're shipping into and out of Canada. The CN actually comes in a little bit farther, so they will rail along their lines. So they do have Illinois, Detroit, Memphis, and their Mays terminals, which is New Orleans for them, and they ship all the way down, as well as the CP comes into Illinois and Minneapolis as well. So you can do those via rail. And then the CSX recently put in the Valleyfield ramp into Montreal. So now they go from many of their locations into Montreal, into Valleyfield, direct by rail. But then you can also use the truck option, and there's a number of places to cross, whether that is New York or Detroit or one of those locations, and you can always bring the truck across and then put it on the rail there. It's just really a matter of where their broker is able to make the filing, and they just have to understand where the crossing points are and have those firm codes in order to be able to do that. Just to give a little bit extra on Canada, and once you're in Canada, I will say that there's a little bit difference on the weight factor. So where we were talking in the U.S. about a 42.5 restriction, in Canada it can go up to 60,000 pounds as long as it's not a thaw season in that area like Montreal or so.
And by the way, that's a great selling point in Canada, the weight. Rick, take a minute and talk about the rail network as it's driven by retail imports, maybe a couple key lanes that people could focus on that are on here that want to get started.
So in terms of key lanes to focus in on, if you're working off the ports, LA is a great place to get started. Lots of containers sit in there. So looking to, LA to Chicago, LA to Atlanta, LA to Jersey, LA to Dallas, LA to Houston, those are not bad places to get started for your retail shippers, particularly since we continue to see the transloading numbers in LA continue to increase. I think I just read something that it's up to 56, 58% of the product that comes into LA is being transloaded off of the 20s and 40s into 53-foot containers or truckload. So there's a great place to start. Those lanes are going to be over 1,000 miles easily, so it's pretty easy to go ahead and help justify for your shippers the benefits of intermodal versus truck in that particular market.
Derek, how about Canada? More in, more out, maybe some key lanes. If I got a customer in Canada, what should I be looking at?
Yeah, we find that there's a lot of traffic coming, Jeff, into Montreal and then around into Ontario as well. So there's a number of points in the U.S. that you can go directly to Montreal or Ontario. And then we do get some east to west in Canada, so from Montreal and Ontario out to the Albertas and as well Vancouver.
And maybe take a minute, talk about the CN's repo program on their small boxes. Hold on just 1 second, Rick. Maybe take a minute to talk about their door-to-door repo program, because it's another opportunity for a broker like me who is not intermodal proficient to use somebody on a door program.
So yeah, you can always call the CN and you can actually go right on their website and get rates, and they will show you what the door-to-door piece is. And going from east to west, so getting those small boxes back out to Vancouver is what they want to do out of the big markets, which is Montreal, that area, Quebec, and then Ontario as well.
And I'll just jump onto that. We have a customer that also works out very well on those boxes, Jeff, in that they'll weigh out before they cube out. As a matter of fact, it actually loads better onto a 40 than it does in a 53, and we're moving literally tons of freight out of the Midwest, and we're getting it over into Western Canada, which is what they want to do to load out their boxes for export. And it is a fantastic product, and it works out much better than the 53s.
One other thing, Jeff, specifically for Canada, we find that there's, because of the temperatures and the fact that it's cold there a lot, they have refrigerated boxes that they own. So you have a capability of getting to shipping reefers within Canada that are owned by the railroads, and you don't have to go to a third party to use them. And they have both heated, which is just, it's on a certain temperature, and then they have a reefers, which you can set at a specific temperature. So there's multiple boxes there that you can utilize.
Question from the floor. There's a lot of discussion about rail grabbing share of domestic intermodal from truck. That's obviously who they're after, right? The highway conversion. How can rail operators make this economical, since rail costs are mostly fixed in nature versus trucks, which have a high variable cost component?
I think,
Rick, go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things is examining the lanes. So as we talked about earlier, there are specific lanes where it really makes sense. If you're close to that rail ramp and you're going a couple thousand miles, that rate is great. And then when you start factoring in fuel, as we know, as fuel goes up, then the rail rate becomes better against trucks. So that's where I think you have to target is looking at the lanes and the distance and where they're associated near the ramps.
And the shorter haul fuel becomes more cost efficient as fuel surcharge rises, correct?
Correct, yes.
Correct.
Rick, take a minute maybe and talk about, we have a question, the percentage of international intermodal. So think of import stack trains for Maersk and APL and people like that versus domestic intermodal. Any idea what the split is?
Pretty close to 50-50.
Yes, that would be my focus also. I would believe that. And while you're on here, talk about maybe you're on this call today and you want to get started. Okay, I go to the IANA website. I find, let's use Sam Ninnis at Norfolk Southern, Tell me what I'm going to have to do to move my first load on the Norfolk Southern, because they're probably the most generous when it comes to their door problem.
Yeah, they are very generous, and as a matter of fact, if you're a TIA member, they actually let you move the first load without having to go through the credit process, or you can at least wait until they go through, checking your credit. But essentially, they're going to have you fill out a credit app. It's online, pretty simple. They're going to ask you to pull down a contract that they'll want you to go ahead and sign, which is basically pretty much a broker-broker contract, which a number of us are familiar with. And then at that point, once everything gets approved, which only takes, in some cases, less than a day. At the very longest, it's going to be a day and a half. And at that point, you can start looking up and asking questions on rates, and they'll get you set up as well on their portal so that you can go ahead and start plugging in the zip-to-zip information, and you'll start seeing the rates pop up.
And do the rails operate for daily? Can I act like a truck if I'm on the railroad with Norfolk Southern or CSX or UP? Can I just get a spot quote for today rather than some kind of contract?
Absolutely. You can do spot quoting all day long if you like.
And it's very easy. That's where the door-to-door programs for the various railroads really work for people, Jeff. If they don't have contracts, that's a great alternative.
I think we've heard a lot of good ideas on today's call. I'd like to turn this back to Hal, but I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and I hope this was worthwhile.
Thanks, everybody. That was terrific. I really appreciate it. For more information about intermodal, visit intermodal.org or email us at info@intermodal.org.